is the story of Jews, because it's the story of the lived experience of Jews, and this picture here and over there is as much a part of Jewish law as possibly can be. If cameras existed during the time in which Jews left Egypt, this picture would exist, and only the clothes would be different. But this is a picture of Jews just before they left. Now, to say we left is not to suggest we were at a party and we decided to go home. Hardly. Although, technically, these specific people weren't kicked out and could have stayed where they were. They left, and for all practical purposes, it's because they were kicked out. We never leave, we Jews never leave of our own volition. We don't leave parties of our own volition. We always have some reason we have to go, and circumstances require that we leave and required these people to leave. And it's the same story in Egypt and the Promised Land and Spain and Iran and Iraq, Yemen, it doesn't matter where. It's the same story. And many of you have a picture just like this. And like this picture, maybe your picture contains people who are looking miserable or like they have a mild case of gas. But in either case, you no doubt have a story with your picture. It's something like this. My great-grandfather or my great-great-grandmother or my great-great-somebody left somewhere, Belarus or Latvia or Lithuania or the Ukraine or Russia, just before they immigrated to the United States or to Israel. This particular picture is my family, sometime before they left Kiev. That austere-looking woman to the far right, your far right, is my maternal great-grandmother, Leah Puckerman Schechtman. Her husband, Daniel, was taking the picture. That's why he's not in it. And that little boy immediately to the left of that woman is my grandfather, Louis Schechtman. He's the father of my mother, who was here with us this afternoon. And his siblings are Joseph, Frida, and Sadie, and Samuel. Now, I don't know precisely when they left, but likely it was sometime shortly after the pogroms of 1905. And they were particularly lethal in the Ukraine. So the Schechtman family picked up and left. Like I said, no one specifically kicked them out. It just wasn't good for them to be there. And this family, the Schechtman family, was among the 2 or 3 million Jews that immigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920. And these millions of Jews share essentially the same story. They left because the persecution of Jews became unbearable. Now, your family may be left from Minsk or Pinsk or Moscow or Vilnius rather than Kiev, but they left for the same reason. They couldn't live as Jews wherever they lived because everywhere we've ever lived, we've been strangers. Now, given the lived experience of our people has always been as strangers, it's no mere coincidence that we flourished here in the United States of America, because America is a country made up entirely of strangers. Now, as it happens, Jewish ethical behavior is deeply rooted in our experience as the stranger. There is no more important idea in the Torah than for us Jews to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. In fact, the most repeated commandment in the Torah is to remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. More text is devoted to the idea of remembering that we were strangers in the land of Egypt than is devoted to the idea of Kashrut, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur combined, and it's not even close. We even have a holy day, my favorite holy day, Passover, that's devoted entirely to this idea of remembering that we were strangers in Egypt. We reference the Exodus in the Kiddush that we chant at every festival and every Shabbat. It's rarely not on the tip of our tongue. The Rav, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, one of the most influential rabbis of the 20th century, taught that the Egyptian experience is the fountainhead and moral inspiration for the teaching of compassion which is so pervasive in Jewish law. He went even further, Soloveitchik did, saying, the oppression of the stranger is an actual betrayal of Jewish law and history. There's nowhere to turn in Judaism without bumping into this central commandment of being kind to the stranger. To ignore this commandment is perilously close to rejecting Judaism itself. America is a country of strangers. Isn't this really one of the foundational stories of America? Demographers estimate that more than 100 million Americans alive today in 2017 trace their roots in this country to the great wave of immigration that took place from 1880 to 1920. Without question, the period of colonization and the Revolutionary War and the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution and the Civil War, these are important foundational stories about this great country. But most Americans today, and most Americans in this room, are not connected by family of origin to those times. The majority of Americans do not trace their roots back beyond 1880 much. This includes not only Jews, but Italians and Irish and Germans and Poles, other Europeans, and millions of Asians and Hispanics. So this picture is at once the foundational story of the Jewish people and a core foundational story of America. Yes, the founding of the United States, as embodied in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, are certainly part of the American foundational story. But the America I know, in the end, the America I know, and in fact the America the vast majority of Jews know, starts with your version of this picture. And virtually every immigrant group has a version of this picture somewhere. Now, although we are in fact a nation of immigrants, that's the fact. In theory, we're not necessarily a nation of immigrants. For most of our country's history, xenophobia and racism, prejudice has been the order of the day. I know he is quite the rage at the moment, but Alexander Hamilton was not exactly an advocate for unfettered immigration. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't have seen or go to see the play. By all means do. But the fact of the matter is that Alexander Hamilton was not a supporter of immigration. He supported the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1789, which actually made it harder for immigrants to become citizens of the United States. He mused with some frequency that immigrants would corrupt the national character. Now, we point to the Statue of Liberty with great pride, as we should, but the reality is that we are a nation of immigrants despite ourselves. There have been sustained and successful attempts to limit immigration throughout the history of America. In 1917, the United States passed the first immigration law, which implemented a literacy requirement for entry to the United States. And in 1924, that law was expanded to include quotas, which did not help Jews. It limited the number of Jews that could immigrate to the United States to 17,000. And after the United States entered World War II in 1941, the United States stopped all immigration from Europe, including Jews. Interestingly, they did a poll when the United States entered World War II, and more than 60% of Americans rejected the idea that America should accept even 10,000 Jewish refugee children. And I think everyone in this room is familiar with the plight of the St. Louis that was rejected from America by Roosevelt himself. Now, despite this history, despite our lived experience as strangers virtually everywhere, there is a tendency, and I understand it, it's quite human, for us to find some way in which the circumstances then don't apply now. So one of these is the oft-repeated idea that Jews then came here legally, and today the issue is illegal immigration. I've already told you that the vast majority of Jews immigrated between 1880 and 1920. And the idea of illegal immigration as we know it today just didn't exist because there were no people overstaying their visas. There were no visas. there were, for all practical purposes, no people sneaking over the border from Mexico because they didn't have to really sneak. They just walked and stayed. There was no real border to speak of. In 1890, President Benjamin Harrison designated Ellis Island as a federal immigration station, and it opened as we know it in 1892. And basically, if you showed up there, you were let in. So to give you some idea of how different the world was, the United States didn't even require a passport to either enter or re-enter the country except in times of war. And only in 1978 did it become law that you needed a passport to either come into the country or leave the country. Did Jews and other Europeans come here illegally? It doesn't have meaning, really. It's not a question that has meaning for that era. Did these European immigrants go to a consulate, an American consulate in Kiev or in Minsk or Pinsk to get permission? Only a very, very few. Many stowed away or came with false identities or otherwise did what they had to do. In fact, I know in speaking with many of you, many Jews throughout the ages, that stories of great-grandparents obtaining false documents or stowing away have become cherished parts of family lore. If your grandparents or your great-grandparents came here with forged documents, or if they bribed people to get documents, or if they stowed away, are you here illegally? Another fallacy is the issue of crime. Some people argue that unlike immigrants of today, Jews weren't criminals and didn't wreak havoc on society. In fact, the well-known Polish immigrant Meyer Lansky made that very same argument. The point here is that every immigrant group has a criminal element, and Jews were no exception. And at the time, many Americans of a xenophobic bent made the case that Jews were criminals and shouldn't be allowed into the United States. For me, the lived experience of Jews, combined with the clear and unequivocal teaching of our tradition on this very issue, holds me to hold an expansive view of immigration. I am the embodiment of this nation's great generosity of spirit when it comes to immigration. Neither my mother's family or my father's family would be here today were it not for the open arms of Lady Liberty welcoming them to freedom. I would feel Jewishly inauthentic and completely hypocritical if I didn't want the same thing for others. And this is most especially true when it comes to DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This is a program that protects those who came here as very young children and allows them to study and work in this country legally. I don't believe that the president is going to repeal DACA, even if Congress does not offer a remedy. But I want to be on the record as saying, because this is such a crucial issue for people and for Jews, that a repeal of DACA would be a moral stain on this nation, on par with the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Most importantly, as I've said, I believe the lived experience of Jews and the clear and unequivocal teaching of Judaism can only lead to one conclusion in terms of DACA. It is morally, in terms of the repeal of DACA, it is morally and Jewishly repugnant. I cannot imagine my grandfather, that little boy over there, he came to this country when he was maybe a year or two older, 4 or 5, being sent back to Kiev when he was a man of 30. What did he know of Kiev? He was a plumber in the United States. This idea borders on the insane. Now, there are those who might say, well, it's simply a matter of following the law. And to that I would say this: Judaism knows something about the law, and Judaism knows something about morality. And in every instance, in every single instance, there are no exceptions to this, in every single instance, when morality and the law come into conflict, morality wins. And this is the reason, for example, you are required to violate the laws of Shabbat on Sabbath. to save a life on the Sabbath. You can't say, well, it's Shabbat, so I can't use my car to take so-and-so to the hospital. Let him bleed to death. In Judaism, upholding the law is never, ever more important than doing the moral thing. On the issue of immigration in general and on DACA in particular, I believe the Jewish tradition speaks as unequivocally as possible. We Jews have unique obligations to the stranger as manifest in the immigrant, based on our own lived experiences and the vast preponderance of Jewish teaching. To believe otherwise is not only morally untenable, in the end it endangers our people. For if we do not speak on behalf of these strangers, who will speak on our behalf when we are once again strangers? The Shechtman family came from Kiev, from Russia. They became Americans. And in today's parlance, my grandfather would be a dreamer. But equally important, his mother, Leah, would be a dreamer. Her dreams have been realized in the dozens of children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren that now spread out from New York to Philadelphia to Arizona to California and Israel and all other points around the globe. There were many people who didn't want this woman to come into this country. There were many people who, if they had their way, would have sent every Jew and every Italian and so on back home without even disembarking. The odds were against Leah Shechtman and the millions of families like her, but Leah Shechtman was a dreamer. And as a result of the generosity of this great country, I and the rest of her family are able to live out those dreams. I went to rabbinic school in New York and I lived in Hoboken. And I used to walk my dog along the shores of the Hudson River next to Frank Sinatra Drive. If I walked far enough south, and if it was a clear enough day, I could see the Statue of Liberty in the distance of New York Harbor. And knowing the history of our people and the history of my family, not once did I fail to give thanks to that lady and her torch. Because for almost a half a century, many years ago, that torch welcomed millions of people, our people among them, my family among them, not merely to this country, but the idea of this country. The idea that whoever you are, wherever you are from, you can have a share of the American dream. How can we, the Jewish people, foreclose the possibility of that dream to others when it has done so much for us? Shana Tova.